I knew I was going to die the moment his hand wrapped around my throat in the restaurant bathroom. Not because he was choking me, but because the man pinning me against the marble sink wasn't the charming art dealer I'd been flirting with for the past hour. And the realization hit me like ice water in my veins when I noticed the scar bisecting his left eyebrow and the cold murder in his identical eyes, telling me everything I needed to know about the terrible mistake I'd just made. I'd been kissing the wrong twin. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because this story doesn't actually start in that bathroom, with my heart hammering against my ribs and my lipstick smeared across my face, like evidence of a crime I didn't know I was committing. And if I'm going to explain how I ended up tangled in the web of the most dangerous man on the East Coast, I need to take you back to 3 hours earlier, when I was still Sophia Chen, 26-year-old art curator with a modest apartment in Brooklyn, and a dating life so pathetic that my best friend had literally threatened to create my dating profile herself if I didn't stop making excuses about being too busy to find love. The restaurant was called Celestino's, one of those impossibly elegant Italian places in Manhattan where the lighting is always perfect and the prices aren't listed on the menu, because if you have to ask, you can't afford to be there. And I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time getting ready, because this was my third date with Marco Valentini, and something about him made me want to be the kind of woman who could belong in places like this. He'd chosen a table near the back, tucked into an alcove that felt intimate without being too private, and when I arrived 15 minutes late because the subway had other plans, he'd stood up with that easy smile that had made me swipe right in the first place, kissing my cheek like we'd known each other for years, instead of 3 carefully orchestrated evenings over the past 2 weeks. Marco was everything I thought I wanted, wrapped up in a 6'2" package of old money charm and Italian features that should have been illegal. Dark hair that curled just slightly at his collar, warm brown eyes that crinkled when he laughed, and this way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room, even when the restaurant was packed with Manhattan's elite. He'd told me on our first date that he worked in his family's art gallery, which had made perfect sense given the way he could talk about Renaissance paintings and modern installations with equal passion, and the fact that our careers overlapped had felt like fate rather than coincidence. Like the universe was finally throwing me a bone after years of dating finance bros who thought Monet was a type of currency. "You look incredible," he'd said when I sat down, and I'd felt that flutter in my stomach that comes from genuine attraction mixed with the hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be something real, because at 26 I was tired of casual hookups and situationships and men who ghosted after 3 dates because I wouldn't sleep with them immediately. And Marco had been different from the start. Patient, interested, asking questions about my work at the gallery, and actually listening to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk about himself. The first hour had been perfect in that effortless way that happens when 2 people genuinely click, with conversation flowing from his recent trip to Venice to acquire a Caravaggio for a private collector to my upcoming exhibition of contemporary Asian artists. And I'd found myself leaning closer across the table, drawn in by the way his voice dropped when he talked about art, like it was something sacred, something worth protecting and cherishing. We'd shared a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my rent, and when his phone buzzed during our appetizers, he'd glanced at it with a frown that seemed to age him somehow, making him look harder around the edges before he'd excused himself with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. "I'm so sorry, Bella, but I need to take this call. Family business that can't wait," he'd said, and I'd waved him off with understanding, because I knew all about demanding families, having grown up with a mother who called me 3 times a day to ask when I was going to stop wasting my expensive art history degree and marry a nice Chinese boy who could give her grandchildren, as if my entire existence was just a waiting room for her future grandmotherly ambitions. I'd excused myself to the bathroom while he was gone, wanting to check my lipstick and maybe text my best friend Mia about how well the date was going, because she'd been invested in my love life ever since her own wedding last year had turned her into an insufferable romantic who believed everyone deserved their happily ever after. The bathroom had been as elegant as the rest of Celestino's, all marble and gold fixtures and lighting that made even my perpetually tired reflection look almost glamorous, and I'd reapplied my lipstick, a bold red that Mia had convinced me to buy because men like Marco notice details, before heading back to our table with a confidence I didn't usually feel on third dates. But when I'd slid back into my seat, everything had changed in ways I couldn't immediately articulate, like when you return to a familiar room and something has been moved just slightly off-center, creating a dissonance that your brain registers before your conscious mind can identify the problem. Marco was there, sitting exactly where he'd been before, but the warmth in his eyes had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. And the way he looked at me made me feel like prey being assessed by a predator who was trying to decide if I was worth the effort of the hunt. "Everything okay with your call?" I'd asked, trying to recapture the easy intimacy we'd had before he'd stepped away. But my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears because something fundamental had shifted in his absence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was suddenly sitting across from a stranger wearing Marco's face. "Fine," he'd said, his voice different too, deeper, rougher, with an edge that made the single word sound like a warning rather than an answer. And when he'd reached across the table to take my hand, his grip had been possessive in a way that sent conflicting signals straight to my nervous system, triggering both fear and an attraction so intense it made my breath catch. The rest of dinner had been surreal, like watching myself in a movie where the script had changed, but no one had told me my lines, because the man across from me was Marco, and wasn't Marco simultaneously. Asking the same questions but with different weight behind them, touching me with a confidence that bordered on ownership rather than the respectful interest he'd shown before. When he'd pulled me into a kiss as we'd waited for dessert, his hand fisting in my hair, and his mouth demanding rather than asking, I'd responded on pure instinct, my body lighting up in ways it hadn't during our previous chaste goodnight kisses, and I'd felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified by the intensity of my own reaction to this darker version of the man I'd been dating. His phone had rung again during that kiss, and when he'd pulled away to check it, his entire face had hardened into something that looked carved from stone, beautiful and cold and utterly merciless, and I'd watched him transform before my eyes into someone I didn't recognize at all. "Excuse me," he'd said, standing abruptly and leaving me breathless and confused at the table, while he'd stalked toward the back of the restaurant with his phone pressed to his ear, his entire body radiating attention that seemed capable of violence. And that's when my survival instincts had finally kicked in, loud enough to be heard over my hormones. I'd excused myself to the bathroom again, needing space to process what was happening and maybe splash some cold water on my face while I figured out if I was having the best date of my life or making a terrible mistake. Because the rational part of my brain was screaming that something was very wrong even as my body was still humming from that kiss. The bathroom had been empty this time, and I'd gripped the edge of the marble sink while I'd stared at my reflection, trying to reconcile the turned-on flush in my cheeks with the anxiety tightening my chest. Because I'd never been the kind of woman who got off on danger, and I didn't understand why my body was responding to Marco's sudden darkness like it was exactly what I'd been craving all along. That's when I'd heard the lock click behind me, and every hair on the back of my neck had stood up in warning as I'd watched the door open in the mirror's reflection, revealing Marco standing there with an expression that made my stomach drop because there was nothing familiar in those eyes anymore. Just cold assessment, and something that looked dangerously close to fury. He'd moved into the bathroom with the fluid grace of someone who knew how to use his body as a weapon, and I'd frozen like a rabbit caught in headlights as he'd crossed the space between us in 3 long strides, his hand coming up to wrap around my throat, with just enough pressure to keep me in place without actually choking me. "Who sent you?" he'd asked, his voice low and deadly serious, and I'd stared at him in complete confusion because I'd had no idea what he was talking about. No framework for understanding why the man I'd been dating for 2 weeks was suddenly treating me like an enemy combatant in the bathroom of an upscale Italian restaurant. "What? Marco, I'd started. But he'd cut me off with a slight increase in pressure against my throat, not enough to hurt, but enough to make his point crystal clear. and the fear that flooded through me had been sharp and clarifying, burning away the fog of attraction and leaving only the crystalline understanding that I was in serious danger from a man I'd thought I knew. "Don't lie to me," he'd said, and there had been something almost weary in his tone, like he was tired of games he'd played too many times before, and I'd opened my mouth to protest my innocence when the bathroom door had burst open again and another man had rushed in. A man who looked exactly like the one holding me against the sink, down to the last detail except for one crucial difference. This one didn't have a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and the expression on his face was pure panic rather than cold fury. "Dante, she doesn't know anything, she's just," the newcomer had said. And I'd felt the world tilt sideways as my brain had tried to process the impossible reality that there were two of them, that I'd somehow ended up caught between identical twins, and the one called Dante had gone absolutely still against me, his eyes narrowing as he'd looked from his brother to me and back again. "Explain," Dante had said, his hand still wrapped around my throat, but his attention entirely on his twin, and I'd watched something like guilt and resignation cross the other man's face. The real Marco's face, I'd realized with dawning horror, as he'd run a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that I'd seen him make a dozen times during our dates. "I've been using your face for dates because no one wants to date the Mafia boss's boring twin, and I thought if I could just get someone to fall for me before they knew the truth about our family, then maybe—" Marco had started, but Dante had released my throat so abruptly that I'd stumbled, backing away from both of them, while my mind had raced to catch up with the revelation that had just been dropped like a bomb into my understanding of reality. "Mafia boss," my brain had repeated, uselessly, because surely that was the kind of thing you only heard about in movies, and not the kind of problem you encountered when swiping right on a dating app in New York City. And I'd looked between the two identical faces, one familiar and guilt-stricken, one strange and dangerous, while everything I'd thought I knew about Marco Valentini had crumbled into dust. The man I'd been dating didn't exist, I'd realized with a sickening lurch, because I'd been falling for a curated version of someone else entirely. And the real man standing in front of me radiating barely controlled violence was someone I'd kissed thinking he was his harmless twin, which meant I'd seen his face, been photographed with him in public, could identify him. And judging by the way he was looking at me now like a problem that needed solving, that made me a liability he couldn't afford to leave walking around with that knowledge. "You've really fucked this up, Marco," Dante had said, his voice quiet and controlled in a way that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. And then he'd grabbed my arm with a grip that would definitely leave bruises and dragged me out of the bathroom while I'd stumbled along behind him, too shocked to even think about screaming or fighting back. He'd pulled me through the restaurant, which I now realized he must own, based on the way the staff had avoided looking at us directly, and into a private room in the back that looked like it was designed for exactly this kind of situation, with soundproof walls and no windows and furniture that had probably witnessed confessions extracted through means I didn't want to imagine. Marco had followed us, wringing his hands and apologizing in rapid-fire Italian that I couldn't understand. And I'd stood there trying to make myself smaller, while these two men who shared the same face argued about what to do with me like I wasn't even present. "She's seen too much," Dante had finally said, cutting through Marco's excuses with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. And I'd felt my knees go weak because I'd known with absolute certainty that this was how my story ended, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of online dating. Another missing woman whose face would end up on true crime podcasts, while amateur detectives speculated about what had happened to her. "Dante, please, you can't just—" Marco had started, but Dante had held up one hand, and his brother had fallen silent immediately, and the power dynamic between them had been clear enough to cut. Marco might have been born with the same face and the same bloodline, but Dante was the one who commanded rooms and expected obedience, the one who'd been forged into something harder and more dangerous by whatever hell their family business had put him through. "She comes with me," Dante had said, And those 4 words had sealed my fate more effectively than any threat could have, because they'd meant I wasn't going to die. Not yet, anyway. But they'd also meant that my life as I knew it was over. And as his men had appeared at the door like shadows summoned by their master's will, I'd realized that I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross, stumbled into a world I couldn't escape. They'd escorted me out through a back entrance to where a black SUV had been waiting with tinted windows and an engine already running, and I'd looked back once to see Marco standing in the doorway, calling after me with apologies that the wind scattered before they could reach my ears, while Dante had slid into the seat beside me, and the door had closed with the finality of a coffin lid. "You wanted a Valentini, cara mia," he'd said as the vehicle had pulled away from the curb, his voice dark with promise and threat in equal measure. And when he'd looked at me with those cold eyes that I'd kissed in the restaurant, thinking they belonged to someone else entirely, I'd felt something shift deep in my chest. Terror, yes. But underneath it, something else I didn't want to name. Something that recognized the predator sitting next to me and whispered that maybe I'd been hunting for exactly this kind of danger all along. "Congratulations," he'd finished, his lips curving into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "You got one." Dante Valentini's penthouse wasn't a cage. It was a gilded throne room where every piece of furniture cost more than my annual salary, and the art on the walls would have made my colleagues at the gallery weep with envy. And I was the unwilling queen he'd captured and placed in the center of it all, like a trophy he hadn't decided whether to keep or discard. For 3 days I'd been his prisoner in this temple of wealth and violence, wandering through rooms that smelled of expensive leather and gun oil. And for 3 nights I'd felt his dark eyes on me through every wall, an invisible presence that watched and waited while he decided if I'd live or die, and the not knowing was almost worse than any sentence he could have pronounced, because at least then I'd know what I was facing instead of existing in this suspended state between captivity and something I didn't have words for yet. I'd woken up that first morning in a bedroom that was easily twice the size of my entire Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by windows that offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, but didn't open no matter how hard I'd tried them, and I'd found designer clothes hanging in the closet in exactly my size, which meant someone had been paying attention to details about me that I hadn't even noticed they were noticing, cataloging my measurements and preferences while I'd been busy falling for a fiction. The bathroom had been stocked with luxury products I recognized from magazine advertisements, but had never been able to afford. And there'd been something deeply unsettling about the care that had gone into making my prison comfortable, as if Dante had been preparing for the possibility of keeping me long before his brother's deception had forced his hand. And I couldn't decide if that made him a careful planner or a predator who'd been circling me all along without my knowledge. Luca had arrived with breakfast on a silver tray around 8 that morning. Dante's second in command, who I'd learned was the closest thing the Mafia boss had to a friend, though friendship seemed like too soft a word for the bond between men who'd killed together and trusted each other with secrets that could destroy empires. He'd been cordial in that professional way that bodyguards and handlers perfected, explaining the rules of my captivity with the same tone someone might use to describe amenities at a hotel. I didn't leave the penthouse. I didn't call anyone. I cooperated with whatever Dante required, and in return, I'd be kept safe and comfortable and alive, which he'd presented as if it were a generous arrangement rather than the bare minimum of human decency. "I want to see Dante," I'd demanded, with more courage than I'd felt, because 3 hours of sleep and the shock of my new reality had burned through my fear and left behind something sharper and angrier, a refusal to simply accept that my entire life could be upended by one case of mistaken identity and a kiss that had landed on the wrong set of identical lips. Luca had smiled at that, an expression that held genuine amusement rather than cruelty, and I'd gotten the sense that he didn't often see people stand up to his boss, that most of Dante's world operated on fear and obedience rather than defiance. "The boss will see you when he's ready, Miss Chen," he'd said, and the fact that he'd known my last name when I'd never given it to Marco had sent another chill down my spine, because it meant they'd researched me, dug into my background, knew things about my life that I'd never consented to share, and I'd felt violated in a way that had nothing to do with physical touch, and everything to do with the illusion of privacy I'd been operating under my entire life. I'd spent that first day exploring my prison with the methodical attention I usually reserved for cataloging new acquisitions at the gallery, mapping out the space and looking for weaknesses I could exploit, or information I could use, because sitting still and waiting for my fate to be decided had never been in my nature, and I'd be damned if I was going to start now. The penthouse had been a study in contradictions. The living spaces decorated with impeccable taste and original artwork that included what I was fairly certain was a legitimate Rothko, while behind false panels and locked doors, I'd found evidence of the darker business Dante conducted. Security monitors showing camera feeds from what must have been dozens of locations throughout the city, a weapons cache that would have made a small army jealous, and filing cabinets full of paperwork for legitimate businesses that I'd recognized as classic money laundering fronts from a documentary I'd watched about organized crime. It had been in Dante's study that I'd found the photograph, tucked into a leather-bound album that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, showing two young boys who were clearly the Valentini twins standing between their parents in front of what appeared to be the same penthouse I was currently trapped in. The mother had been beautiful in that classic Italian way, with dark hair and warm eyes that both her sons had inherited, and she'd had her hands on the boys' shoulders in a gesture of protection that had made my throat tight, because even through the fading photograph, I'd been able to see the love there, the fierce maternal devotion that wanted to shield her children from a world that was clearly already reaching for them with grasping hands. The father had been handsome but hard, his smile not reaching his eyes even in what should have been a family portrait, and I'd wondered what kind of man raised sons in a world of violence and expected them to thrive. What kind of legacy he'd built that required one son to become a monster, and the other to pretend that heritage didn't exist. Dinner that first evening had been an exercise in psychological warfare, though I hadn't fully understood that until Dante had finally deigned to join me at the massive dining table that could have seated 20, but felt infinitely more intimate set for just 2. He'd appeared in the doorway precisely at 8, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that I absolutely should not have been noticing, given the circumstances. And he'd moved through the space with the confidence of someone who owned everything his eyes touched, including me, his expression had suggested, though I'd been determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much that presumption affected me. "I trust Luca made you comfortable," he'd said as he'd taken his seat at the head of the table, pouring wine for both of us with steady hands that I'd watched kiss the stems of the crystal glasses, and I'd been unable to stop myself from remembering how those same hands had felt wrapped around my throat in the restaurant bathroom, the perfect calibration of pressure that had communicated threat without actually causing harm. As comfortable as one can be when they've been kidnapped and held prisoner against their will, I'd shot back, pleased when my voice had come out steady rather than shaking, because I'd needed him to see that I wasn't going to simply break under the weight of his power, that whatever he'd expected when he'd decided to keep me, I wasn't going to make it easy for him. He'd studied me over the rim of his wine glass with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through all my carefully constructed defenses, and I'd felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the designer dress someone had left in my closet. Black silk that hugged every curve and made me feel like I was dressed for seduction rather than captivity, which had probably been exactly the point. "You're angry," he'd observed, as if my emotions were simply data points for him to catalog and analyze, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to whatever calculations he was running in that criminal mind. "I'm furious," I'd corrected, leaning forward with the intensity that had surprised even me, because somewhere between waking up in his penthouse and sitting across from him at dinner, my fear had alchemized into rage, white-hot and clarifying. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be part of your brother's pathetic catfishing scheme. I didn't ask to kiss you thinking you were him. I didn't ask to become a liability in whatever game you're playing with your enemies. And I sure as hell didn't ask to have my entire life destroyed because I swiped right on the wrong dating profile. Something had flickered across his face then. Too quick for me to identify, but gone before I could analyze it. And he'd set down his wine glass with deliberate care before responding. "You think this is about you?" he'd said, his voice soft but carrying an edge that had made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in warning. And I'd realized that I'd miscalculated somewhere, misunderstood the game we were playing, and the stakes involved. "You think I took you because you're special somehow, because there's something about Sophia Chen that warranted my attention. But the truth is infinitely simpler, and much more brutal. You were photographed with me, Kara, at one of my restaurants, kissing me in full view of security cameras that my enemies monitor religiously, looking for exactly this kind of weakness. And by the time I realized Marco's deception, it was already too late to contain the damage." He'd stood then, moving around the table with that predatory grace that I'd noticed in the restaurant, and I'd forced myself to stay seated even as every instinct had screamed at me to run, because running would have meant admitting defeat, and I'd already lost too much to surrender what little dignity I had left. "3 rival families would kill to use you as leverage against me," he'd continued, stopping behind my chair and placing his hands on the back of it, caging me in without actually touching me, and I'd felt the heat of his body radiating against my back like a furnace. "They would take you apart piece by piece looking for information you don't have. They would hurt you in ways designed to hurt me. And they would leave what remains of you on my doorstep as a message about the cost of showing weakness in this world." I'd turned in my chair to look up at him, refusing to let him loom over me without meeting his eyes, and what I'd seen there had stolen my breath. Not cruelty or indifference, but something that looked almost like regret, wrapped in layers of necessity and pragmatism. "So keeping me close isn't cruelty," I'd said slowly, working through the implications of what he was telling me. "It's survival. Yours and mine." "Finally, she understands," he'd murmured, reaching out to touch my face with fingers that had trembled almost imperceptibly, as if the contact had cost him something I couldn't measure. And I'd felt my body respond to that touch with a heat that had shame flooding through me because I absolutely should not have been attracted to my captor, should not have wanted to lean into that touch like a flower seeking sunlight. I should have killed you the moment I realized what Marco had done. It would have been cleaner, kinder even, to end it quickly rather than dragging you into this world where innocence is a luxury people like us can't afford. But I looked at you standing there in that bathroom, terrified and furious, and so goddamn beautiful it hurt. And I couldn't do it, Sophia. I couldn't make myself pull that trigger even though every rational part of my brain was screaming that keeping you alive was a mistake I'd regret. His thumb had traced my cheekbone with a gentleness that had contradicted everything I thought I knew about Dante Valentini, and I'd found myself caught between wanting to pull away and wanting to press closer, my body at war with my mind about what this man represented and what he made me feel. "Why?" I'd whispered, because I'd needed to understand what stayed his hand when he'd built an empire on ruthless decision-making and the willingness to eliminate threats without hesitation. "I'm still trying to figure that out," he'd admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice had cracked something open inside my chest, because this was the first real thing he'd given me, the first glimpse of the man beneath the Mafia boss persona he wore like armor. The rest of dinner had passed in a strange détente, with Dante explaining the rules of his world in clinical detail, the families, the territories, the unspoken codes that governed the criminal underworld of New York City, and how my presence in his life had shifted the board in ways that would have consequences neither of us could fully predict yet. He'd talked about growing up in this world, about learning to read violence like other children learn to read books, about the impossible weight of inheriting an empire at 23, when his father had been murdered by the Kozlov family in a power play that had failed, but left scars that had never healed. Marco refused the life, Dante had said at one point, staring into his wine like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else, and I'd heard the complicated mix of resentment and relief in his voice when he'd talked about his twin. He saw what it did to our father, what it would do to him, And he walked away, went to university, studied art history, pretended he could escape the blood in his veins by surrounding himself with beauty instead of violence, and I let him because someone in this family should get to stay human. And you? I'd asked, emboldened by wine and the surreal intimacy of the conversation, because I'd needed to understand what would make a man willingly shoulder that burden alone, rather than sharing it with the only person who could truly understand. I became the monster our world required, he'd said simply, meeting my eyes with an intensity that had made my breath catch. And in that moment I'd seen him clearly. Not the Mafia boss who'd dragged me from a restaurant, but a man who'd sacrificed his own humanity to protect his brothers, who'd taken all the darkness of their legacy onto himself so Marco could live in the light. And the tragedy of that choice had made my heart ache in ways I hadn't been prepared for. Late that third night, when I'd given up on sleep and wandered through the penthouse in one of the silk robes someone had provided, I'd found Dante in his study surrounded by monitors and paperwork, still dressed despite the hour approaching 3 a.m. And I'd realized that he probably never slept. That rest was another luxury he couldn't afford when maintaining his empire required constant vigilance. He hadn't seemed surprised by my presence, hadn't even looked up from the security footage he'd been reviewing, and I'd been about to retreat when I'd seen what he was watching on repeat. The restaurant footage from that night. The moment when I'd returned from the bathroom and kissed him thinking he was Marco, and the way his entire body had gone rigid with surprise before he'd responded with a hunger that had nothing to do with deception and everything to do with genuine desire. "How many times have you watched that?" I'd asked, moving into the study uninvited because something about seeing him watch us had emboldened me, had made me feel like maybe I wasn't the only one caught off guard by the chemistry that had sparked between us in that moment of mistaken identity. "Enough to memorize every detail," he'd admitted, finally looking up at me with eyes that burned in the dim light of the monitors. And there'd been something vulnerable in his expression that I'd never expected to see from a man who ruled through fear and violence. "You kissed me like you wanted to be consumed, Sophia. Like you were hungry for something darker than the sweet romance my brother was selling you. And I've been trying to figure out if that was real or just my own wishful thinking, my damaged psyche seeing what it wanted to see in a moment that meant nothing." I'd moved closer without consciously deciding to, drawn by the rawness in his voice and the question hanging between us that I wasn't sure I knew how to answer, because the truth was complicated and messy, and I didn't fully understand it myself. "I don't know what it was," I'd said honestly, stopping on the other side of his desk where the monitors painted our faces in shifting light and shadow. "But I felt it too. Something different, dangerous, like kissing you flipped a switch inside me that I didn't know existed, and I spent the rest of that dinner before everything went to hell, trying to convince myself it was just the wine or the atmosphere or anything other than what it actually felt like." "Which was?" he'd prompted, standing slowly and moving around the desk with that predatory focus that made me feel like the most important thing in his world. And I'd known that whatever I said next would change the dynamic between us in ways I couldn't take back. Like I'd been waiting my whole life to kiss someone who could match the darkness I've spent years pretending I don't have, I'd whispered, the confession pulled from some deep place I usually kept locked down tight. And I'd watched his eyes darken with an emotion that looked like triumph mixed with something almost tender. And before I could second-guess myself or retreat behind the walls I'd built to survive 3 days of captivity, he'd been there, cupping my jaw with both hands and searching my face like he was looking for permission I wasn't sure I should give. "I'm going to kiss you again, Sophia," he'd said, the words a statement rather than a question. "And this time there won't be any confusion about who I am or what this means, and if you're going to stop me, you need to do it now, because once I start, I won't be able to be gentle with you. I won't be able to pretend that keeping you here is just about protection and strategy when we both know it stopped being that simple the moment I decided not to kill you." I'd had a choice in that moment. I could have stepped back, could have retreated to the safety of my designated prison, and maintained the illusion that I was nothing more than a captive waiting for rescue. But the truth was that nobody was coming to save me because nobody even knew I was missing. And more importantly, I wasn't sure I wanted to be saved from a man who saw the parts of me I'd hidden from everyone else and wanted them anyway. "Then don't be gentle," I'd heard myself say, the words coming from that dark place inside me that had responded to his kiss in the restaurant. And I'd watched something fierce and possessive flash across his face before he'd closed the distance between us and claimed my mouth with a kiss that had nothing to do with the sweet romance I'd been expecting from Marco, and everything to do with conquest and claiming and a hunger that matched my own. His hands had moved from my jaw to my hair, fisting in the strands and angling my head exactly where he wanted it, while his other hand had gripped my hip hard enough to bruise, and I'd gasped against his mouth at the intensity of sensation, at the way my body had ignited like he'd found the match that perfectly fit my kindling. The kiss had been consuming in exactly the way he'd warned me about, his tongue invading my mouth with the same ruthless efficiency he probably applied to taking territory, and I'd responded by pressing closer, by sliding my hands under his shirt to feel the heat of his skin and the muscles that shifted beneath my palms, and I'd felt him groan against my mouth like my touch was affecting him just as profoundly as his was affecting me. He'd lifted me onto his desk without breaking the kiss, scattering papers and files that probably contained state secrets or criminal conspiracies. But neither of us had cared because the space between us had been crackling with months of tension, compressed into 3 days of proximity and denial. And when he'd stepped between my thighs and pulled me to the edge of the desk so I could feel exactly how much he wanted me, I'd wrapped my legs around his waist and surrendered to the inevitable gravity pulling us together. "Tell me to stop," he'd demanded against my neck, where he'd been trailing kisses that had made my head fall back in offering. "Tell me this is wrong and you don't want this and I'll walk away right now and we'll never speak of it again." But I couldn't tell him that, because it would have been a lie, and I'd already had enough deception between us to last a lifetime. So instead I'd pulled his face back to mine and kissed him with all the hunger I'd been suppressing, and I'd felt his control snap like a wire pulled too tight, his hands moving to the belt of my robe while mine had worked on his shirt buttons with shaking fingers that couldn't move fast enough. We'd made it as far as him pushing the robe off my shoulders before the sound of footsteps in the hallway had made us both freeze, and Luca's voice calling for Dante about some urgent business had shattered the moment like glass, bringing reality crashing back in with all its complications. Dante had stepped back with visible effort, his chest heaving and his eyes wild with frustrated desire, and he'd looked at me sitting there on his desk in my ruined robe, with my lips swollen from his kisses, and something like anguish had crossed his face. "Go back to your room, Sophia," he'd said roughly, already turning away to grab his discarded shirt, and I'd felt the dismissal like a slap, even though I'd understood the necessity of it, because whatever was happening between us couldn't happen in stolen moments between his criminal obligations. I'd slid off the desk and retied my robe with trembling hands, moving toward the door on unsteady legs, while my mind had raced to process what had just happened, and what it meant for my carefully maintained denial that I was anything other than Dante Valentini's unwilling prisoner. At the threshold I'd paused, looking back at him standing there in the dim light of his monitors, looking more alone than I'd ever seen another human being look, and words had spilled out before I could stop them. "This isn't going to go away just because you want it to, you know. This thing between us, it's not just chemistry or Stockholm Syndrome or whatever rationalization you're already building in that strategic mind of yours." He'd turned to face me fully then, and what I'd seen in his expression had stolen my breath. Desire, yes, but underneath it, something that looked dangerously close to hope, fragile and desperate, and utterly at odds with the ruthless mafia boss persona he projected to the world. "I know," he'd said quietly, the admission clearly costing him something. "And that's what terrifies me most, because everyone I've ever cared about has ended up dead, Sophia. And I don't think I could survive being the reason you—" But he'd cut himself off, shaking his head like he'd said too much already. "Then don't love me halfway," I'd found myself saying, the words coming from some reckless place inside me that had apparently decided tonight was the night for burning down all my self-preservation instincts. And I'd walked back to him despite knowing I should run in the opposite direction. Don't protect me from your world by keeping me at arm's length. Don't pretend this is just about strategy and survival, when we both know something changed the moment you decided not to kill me. Teach me how to survive here, Dante. Teach me how to be someone who can stand at your side instead of cowering behind you, because I refuse to spend the rest of my life as a liability you're protecting. He'd stared at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. And then his phone had buzzed with what must have been an urgent message because he'd looked at it and cursed in Italian fluid enough to make me blush. We'll finish this conversation tomorrow, he'd promised, already moving toward the door where I could hear Luca's footsteps returning. But Sophia... He'd paused, turning back one more time with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'm going to hold you to that challenge. And if you're serious about wanting to be part of this world instead of just existing in it, tomorrow your real education begins, because if you're going to be mine, you need to be untouchable. The possessiveness in those words should have terrified me, should have sent me running back to my room to barricade the door and figure out what kind of psychological break I was clearly experiencing. But instead I'd felt a dark thrill run through me at the promise implicit in his tone. And as I'd finally made my way back to my bedroom, with my lips still tingling from his kisses, and my body still humming with unfulfilled desire, I'd realized with stunning clarity that I'd already made my choice somewhere between that first kiss in the restaurant and this moment. I was going to stop fighting the gravity pulling me toward Dante Valentini, and instead I was going to dive in headfirst and discover exactly what kind of woman I could become in his dark world. And heaven help me, I couldn't wait to find out. They say you can't fall in love with your captor, that it's just Stockholm Syndrome, survival instinct, psychological manipulation dressed up as emotion. But they're wrong about so many things, because I was falling for Dante Valentini not despite the darkness that clung to him like a second skin, but because of it. Because for the first time in my carefully curated life of gallery openings and safe choices and men who wanted the polished version of me that fit into their acceptable narratives, someone saw the shadows I'd hidden behind my art curator smile and didn't just accept them, but wanted to set them free. Wanted to see what I could become if I stopped apologizing for the parts of myself that craved something more dangerous than the life I'd been living. True to his word, Dante had appeared at my door the next morning, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, looking every inch the legitimate businessman, except for the slight darkness under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as I had after our encounter in his study. And when he'd told me to dress in something elegant because we had a business meeting to attend, I'd felt a thrill run through me that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. Because this was it. This was him actually following through on his promise to bring me into his world, instead of keeping me locked away like a secret he was ashamed of. The dress that had been waiting in my closet was a deep emerald silk that hugged every curve before flowing out from my hips, in a way that made me feel like some kind of dark princess. And when I'd emerged from my room to find Dante waiting with a velvet box in his hands, I'd known without opening it that whatever was inside would be another chain binding me to him. Another piece of evidence that I was being absorbed into the Valentini empire whether I'd consciously agreed to it or not. The diamonds inside had been obscene. A necklace that looked like it belonged in a museum, rather than around someone's throat, with stones so flawless they'd caught the morning light and thrown it back in rainbow fractals that had made me gasp despite myself. And when Dante had fastened it around my neck with fingers that had lingered against my skin just long enough to make my breath catch, I'd met his eyes in the mirror and seen the possession there, the clear message that he was marking me as his in a language the entire criminal underworld would understand. In this world, perception is power, he'd said, his hands still resting on my shoulders while we'd both stared at our reflection, him dark and dangerous behind me, me transformed into something that looked like I belonged at his side rather than cowering in fear of him. You're mine now, Sophia, and when we walk into that auction today, Every person in that room needs to understand that touching you means war with me. That even looking at you wrong will have consequences they can't afford to pay. So I need you to act like it. Act like you belong here. Like you chose this. Like being claimed by me is exactly what you wanted all along. The auction house had been in Midtown, one of those establishments that dealt in art so expensive in provenance, so questionable that they didn't advertise their sales to the general public. And as we'd walked in with Dante's hand possessively placed at the small of my back, I'd felt every eye in the room turn to assess us, to catalog this new development in Dante Valentini's carefully controlled public image. The crowd had been a mixture of legitimate art collectors and criminals using the auction as a front for money laundering, and I'd recognized several pieces on the auction block from my work at the gallery. A Modigliani that had supposedly been lost in World War II, a Klimt that had been reported stolen from a private collection in Vienna, and enough Renaissance paintings of dubious provenance to fill a small museum. Dante had guided me through the crowd with the confidence of someone who owned every space he entered, introducing me to dangerous men with legitimate business cards, and their wives who'd smiled at me with the predatory assessment of sharks recognizing new competition in their waters. And I'd played my part beautifully, because years of attending gallery openings and schmoozing with wealthy collectors had prepared me for exactly this kind of performance, even if the stakes were infinitely higher than whether someone bought a piece from our collection. We'd taken our seats in the back row, where Dante could watch the entire room. Strategic positioning that I'd recognized from movies about men like him, always keeping exits in sight and potential threats in his peripheral vision. And when the auction had started, his hand had found my thigh beneath the catalog we were sharing, a possessive touch that had made concentration on the artwork nearly impossible. It had been during the bidding on a Caravaggio that Victor Kozlov had made his move, appearing at the end of our row with a smile that hadn't reached his cold blue eyes. And I'd felt Dante go absolutely still beside me in a way that had reminded me of predators freezing before they struck. Every muscle coiled and ready for violence that was barely contained beneath his civilized exterior. Victor had been handsome in that brutal Slavic way, all sharp cheekbones and platinum hair, and an aura of danger that had made my survival instincts scream warnings. And when he'd leaned down to speak, his English had carried just enough accent to make it exotic rather than foreign. "Dante, you didn't mention you'd acquired such a beautiful new asset," Victor had said, his eyes raking over me with an assessment that had made my skin crawl. And I'd understood immediately that this was a test, a challenge disguised as politeness to see how Dante would react to someone encroaching on what he'd claimed as his. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Victor Kozlov, and you are?" I'd opened my mouth to respond, to handle this the way I would have handled any awkward interaction at a gallery event. But Dante's hand had tightened on my thigh in warning before he'd smoothly pulled me onto his lap in full view of the entire auction house, the gesture so possessive and territorial that several people had actually gasped at the breach of social etiquette. "She's mine, Victor," Dante had said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear that this wasn't a casual statement, but a declaration of war if the other man chose to press the issue. "And unless you want to find out exactly how far I'll go to protect what belongs to me, I suggest you return to your seat and keep your eyes on the artwork instead of my woman." The electricity in that moment had been palpable, with half the room holding their breath waiting to see if Victor would back down or if we were about to witness violence erupt in the middle of a high-end art auction. And I'd felt Dante's heart hammering against my back, where I was pressed against his chest, felt the coiled violence in his body that was ready to explode into action if Victor made the wrong choice. After what had felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, Victor had smiled, an expression that had promised future retribution, even as he'd acknowledged the current power dynamic, and had stepped back, with his hands raised in mock surrender. "Of course, my apologies for the misunderstanding," Victor had said smoothly, but his eyes had promised me that this wasn't over, that I'd just become a piece on whatever chessboard he and Dante were playing on. And as he'd walked away, I'd felt Dante's entire body shudder with the effort of controlling the violence he'd been prepared to unleash. I'd stayed on his lap for the rest of the auction, because moving would have suggested weakness, would have implied that Dante's possessive display had been for show rather than genuine claiming. And by the time the final piece had sold, and we'd made our exit, my body had been humming with a mixture of fear and arousal that I'd never experienced before, turned on by the casual way Dante had claimed ownership over me, even as the rational part of my brain had screamed that I should be offended by being treated like property. The car ride to wherever we were going next had been silent and charged, with Dante staring out the window at the city passing by, while his hand had remained on my thigh, like he needed the physical contact to ground himself. And when we'd finally pulled up to what looked like an exclusive private club in the financial district, he'd turned to me with eyes that had burned with something dark and hungry. "I need you to understand something, Sophia," he'd said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "What happened back there with Victor wasn't just theater or strategy. When I pulled you onto my lap and told him you were mine, I meant every word of it. And if he'd pushed the issue even 1 inch further, I would have killed him right there in front of 200 witnesses, and damn the consequences. Because the thought of another man touching you makes me want to burn the entire city down until nothing remains but ashes and the understanding that you belong to me." The intensity of his confession should have terrified me, should have sent me running for the nearest exit, because this was clearly a man who was possessive to the point of violence. But instead I'd felt something inside me respond to that dark declaration with a hunger that matched his own. And I'd leaned closer until our faces were inches apart, and I could feel his breath against my lips. "Then stop talking about it and show me," I'd whispered, the challenge clear in my voice, and I'd watched his control snap like a wire pulled too tight, his hand fisting in my hair, while his mouth had crashed into mine with a desperation that had tasted like possession and promise, and the complete abandonment of any pretense that what was happening between us was anything other than two damaged people finding their perfect match in each other's darkness. We'd barely made it inside the club before his hands had been all over me, pulling me into a private elevator that had required a keycard to access, and pressing me against the wall while his mouth had traveled from my lips to my neck, to the hollow of my throat where my pulse had been hammering like a trapped bird. The elevator had risen smoothly while we'd consumed each other with kisses that had grown increasingly desperate, and when the doors had opened directly into what was clearly a private floor, Dante had lifted me without breaking contact, carrying me through a doorway into a space that had looked like it was designed for exactly this kind of encounter. All leather and dark wood and a bed that had dominated the room like an altar waiting for sacrifice. He'd laid me down on silk sheets that had felt cool against my overheated skin, and for just a moment he'd stood there looking at me with an expression that had been almost reverent, like he couldn't quite believe I was real and willing and spread out before him like an offering. "Last chance to run, cara mia," he'd said, his voice rough with desire but his eyes serious, giving me one final opportunity to retreat from the edge we were about to throw ourselves over. "Because once I have you, once we cross this line, there's no going back to pretending this is just about protection or strategy. You'll be mine in every way that matters, and I don't know how to be casual about things that belong to me. Don't know how to share or let go or do anything other than hold on with everything I have until my knuckles are white, and the world knows better than to try taking you away." But running had never really been an option. Not from the moment he'd decided not to kill me in that restaurant bathroom. Not from the moment I'd kissed him in his study and felt something fundamental shift inside me. So instead of retreating, I'd reached up to pull him down to me, wrapping myself around him and whispering against his ear that I didn't want casual, didn't want safe, didn't want anything other than whatever dark and twisted and beautiful thing we could build together in the ruins of my old life. He'd made love to me like he was trying to claim every inch of my body and soul, with intensity that had bordered on worship and possession in equal measure. And I'd given him everything he'd demanded and more, meeting his darkness with my own and discovering that when two people stop pretending to be something they're not, the resulting collision can be catastrophic in the most beautiful way. afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled like sex and his cologne, I'd trace the scars on his chest with trembling fingers, while he'd played with my hair and stared at the ceiling, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. My mother was killed by the Kozlov family when Marco and I were 16, he'd said suddenly, the confession coming without preamble like he needed to tell me before he lost his nerve. They wanted to send my father a message about territorial disputes, so they took the thing he loved most, and they butchered her in ways that still give me nightmares. And my father, he didn't just grieve. He became something monstrous in his quest for revenge, turning our home into a fortress and our family into an army. And he was so consumed by his need to make someone pay that he didn't notice he was destroying his sons in the process. I'd pressed a kiss to his chest above his heart, a silent acknowledgement of the pain he was sharing, and he'd continued in a voice that had grown rougher with each word. Marco tried to stand up to him once, tried to say that maybe we should consider peace instead of perpetual war, and our father beat him so badly he was hospitalized for a week. And I realized in that moment that if I didn't do something, our father was going to kill Marco either through violence or by forcing him into a life that would destroy his soul. So I made a choice. I killed our father myself, made it look like the Kozlov family had gotten to him, and I took over the empire at 23 with Marco's blood metaphorically on my hands, and the understanding that I'd become exactly the monster our father had been trying to create. The weight of that confession had hung between us like a physical thing, and I'd understood then why Marco had run from this life, why he'd hidden behind fake identities and art galleries while his twin had shouldered the entire burden of their family's legacy. And I'd also understood why Dante had been so terrified of letting anyone close enough to matter, because everyone he'd ever loved had either died or been destroyed by the violence that surrounded him, like a permanent shadow. Marco blames himself, I'd said softly, thinking about the guilt-stricken man who'd burst into that bathroom to save me from his brother's wrath. He thinks if he'd been stronger, you wouldn't have had to become this. He's wrong, Dante had said flatly, pulling me closer until I'd been draped across his chest like a living blanket. I became the monster so he could stay human, and I'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat, because at least one of us got to escape. At least one of us gets to live a normal life surrounded by beauty instead of blood. And that has to count for something even if it means I'll never have that option for myself. I'd lifted my head to look at him then. Really look at him. Seeing past the Mafia boss exterior to the man underneath who'd sacrificed everything, including his own humanity, to protect someone he loved. And I'd felt my heart crack wide open with an emotion I hadn't been ready to name yet. What if you didn't have to do it alone anymore? I'd asked, the question forming before I'd fully thought through the implications. What if instead of protecting me from your world, you let me help you carry the weight of it? Let me be someone who understands the choices you've had to make and doesn't judge you for the monster you became because someone had to, and you loved your brother enough to volunteer for that hell? He'd stared at me like I'd just offered him something he'd never dared hope for, his eyes suspiciously bright in the dim light filtering through the curtains. And when he'd kissed me again, it had been different from before. Gentler, almost reverent, like I was something precious he was afraid of breaking. You don't know what you're offering, he'd whispered against my lips. But I'd heard the desperate hope underneath the warning, the part of him that wanted so badly to believe that someone could see all of him and not run screaming in the opposite direction. Then teach me, I'd challenged, using his own words from the night before against him. Show me your world, Dante, all of it. The good, the bad, the absolutely terrifying, and let me decide if I'm strong enough to stand beside you instead of assuming I'll shatter the first time things get difficult. Because I'm so tired of people underestimating me. Of being treated like I'm made of glass instead of the same dark matter as everyone else. And maybe I stumbled into your life by accident, but I'm choosing to stay on purpose. So either accept that or let me go, because this halfway thing where you claim me but don't trust me is going to destroy us both. The silence that had followed my declaration had stretched just long enough to make me nervous, to make me wonder if I'd pushed too hard and revealed too much. But then Dante had rolled us, so he'd been hovering over me with his weight supported on his forearms, and his eyes burning with an intensity that had stolen my breath. "If you want in, you're all in," he'd said, the words both a promise and a warning. "No more protected princess locked away in my penthouse. If you're serious about this, about us, then tomorrow I'm taking you to meet the Commission, the ruling council of families that govern our world, and I'm presenting you as my wife and equal partner, which means every enemy I've made becomes your enemy too. Every war I'm fighting becomes your war, and there's no going back once they know your face and your name and your connection to me, so you need to be absolutely certain this is what you want before we take that step." My heart had been racing at the implications of what he was offering. Not just acceptance into his world, but true partnership. The kind of equality that most women in organized crime never achieved because they were seen as accessories rather than assets. And I'd realized that this was my crossroads moment. The point where I either committed fully to this insane path I'd found myself on, or retreated to safety, and spent the rest of my life wondering what I could have become if I'd been brave enough to choose the darkness. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I'd told him, meaning every word even though the rational part of my brain had been screaming that this was madness, that normal people didn't decide to marry into the Mafia after being kidnapped, that whatever I thought I felt for Dante Valentini was probably just trauma bonding and psychological manipulation rather than genuine emotion. But I'd stopped listening to that rational voice the moment Dante had decided not to kill me, had stopped trusting the safe path the moment I'd kissed him in his study, and felt my entire world realign around this dangerous man who saw through all my carefully constructed defenses. And as he'd sealed my fate with another kiss that had quickly escalated into round 2 of the most intense physical connection I'd ever experienced, I'd felt something like freedom flooding through my veins because I was finally letting myself be the woman I'd always suspected lurked beneath the surface. The one who craved power and danger, and a love that could burn down the world if necessary. The wedding had happened so fast it had made my head spin. A Catholic ceremony in a private chapel officiated by a cardinal who was clearly on Dante's payroll, with Luca and a handful of Dante's most trusted men as witnesses, and Marco standing as best man, looking simultaneously relieved that I was choosing this, and guilty that his deception had led me here in the first place. I'd walked down the aisle in a dress that had appeared in my room that morning. Blood-red silk that had made me look like some kind of avenging angel rather than a blushing bride. And when Dante had turned to watch me approach, with an expression that had mixed possessive hunger, with something that looked dangerously close to awe, I'd felt every doubt evaporate because this was right in a way nothing else in my carefully planned life had ever been. His vows had been a dark promise delivered in Italian, and then translated for my benefit. Words about killing for me and dying for me and burning the entire world down if anyone tried to take me from him. And when it had been my turn, I'd abandoned the traditional vows entirely and simply said what was in my heart. "I choose you, Dante Valentini, every dark, broken, beautiful piece of you, and I promise to stand beside you through whatever hell comes next, to be your partner instead of your possession, and to love you with the same intensity you've shown me, even when it terrifies me how much power you have to destroy me if this goes wrong." The kiss that had sealed our marriage had been witnessed by men who'd killed without hesitation, and a cardinal who'd probably blessed weapons along with babies. And when Dante had whispered against my lips that I was his now in the eyes of God and man, and no power on earth could take me from him, I'd felt the truth of it settle into my bones like an anchor, grounding me in this new reality I'd chosen. The reception had been held in the same club where we'd consummated our relationship hours earlier, and I'd been introduced to Dante's world properly. The soldiers and captains and underbosses who formed the infrastructure of his empire, all of them watching me with varying degrees of skepticism and respect, as they'd tried to figure out if I was a weakness their boss had acquired, or an asset that would make him stronger. It had been near midnight when Victor Kozlov had appeared at the reception uninvited, flanked by his own men and wearing a smile that had promised violence beneath the congratulations he'd offered. And I'd felt Dante go absolutely still beside me in that dangerous way that preceded bloodshed. Congratulations on your marriage, Dante, Victor had said, his accent thicker than it had been at the auction. Though I have to say, the speed of this union suggests either true love or desperate strategy. And I'm curious which category your new bride falls into. Because in my experience, women acquired through protection rather than choice tend to become liabilities rather quickly. The insult had been clear enough to make several of Dante's men reach for weapons they'd hidden beneath expensive suits. But I'd placed my hand on Dante's arm in silent communication before stepping forward to address Victor myself, because if I was going to be Dante's equal partner, rather than just his protected wife, I needed to establish my own presence rather than hiding behind my husband's reputation. I'd be careful about making assumptions regarding my choices, Mr. Kozlov, I'd said with a smile that I'd learned from watching the dangerous women at the auction. Because I chose Dante Valentini with full knowledge of who and what he is, and I chose this life with my eyes wide open to the dangers and the darkness, which means I'm not a liability for you to exploit, but a partner who'll stand beside my husband when he makes you regret whatever game you think you're playing by showing up uninvited to our wedding. The room had gone absolutely silent at my challenge, because apparently wives in this world didn't typically speak for themselves, let alone issue veiled threats to rival family heads. But Dante's hand had found mine and squeezed in silent approval, and when Victor's smile had grown sharper and more dangerous, I'd known I'd just painted a target on my back that would have consequences neither of us could fully predict yet. I look forward to seeing if you can back up that confidence, Mrs. Valentini, Victor had said, before turning to leave with his men. And as the door had closed behind him, Dante had pulled me against his chest and whispered that I was either the bravest or most foolish woman he'd ever met, and he hadn't decided yet which assessment was more accurate. But as we'd stood there surrounded by his world with my new wedding ring heavy on my finger, and the understanding that I'd just declared war alongside my husband against enemies who would happily destroy us both, I'd felt more alive than I ever had in my safe, predictable, ordinary life. And when Dante had asked me one final time if I had any regrets about the choice I'd made, I'd pulled him down for a kiss that had communicated everything I couldn't find words for, that I regretted nothing, feared nothing, and was ready to burn alongside him if that's what loving him required. They say every queen needs her king, but in the Valentini Empire I'd learned a truth that the outside world would never understand. Kings are born into power through bloodlines and legacy, and the accident of being male in a world that valued such things. But queens, real queens who commanded respect rather than simply wearing crowns, are forged in blood and fire and impossible choices, tested by enemies who wanted to break them, and refined by lovers who saw their potential for darkness, and helped them embrace it rather than hide from it. And I was about to take my throne not because Dante had given me permission, or the commission had granted me acceptance, but because I'd survived everything they'd thrown at me and emerged stronger on the other side, transformed from an art curator who'd swiped right on the wrong dating profile into a woman who could navigate both the legitimate world and the criminal underworld with equal skill and ruthlessness. The explosion that had torn through our SUV should have killed us both. Would have killed us if Dante hadn't made the split-second decision to throw himself over me, while the armored vehicle had rolled 3 times before slamming into a concrete barrier. And I'd woken up in a hospital for the second time in a month, this time with Dante in the bed beside me instead of sitting vigil in a chair. Both of us battered and burned, but miraculously alive because the armor plating and bulletproof glass that had seemed like paranoid excess when I'd first seen the vehicle had been the only thing standing between us, and the kind of death that left nothing identifiable for the morgue to process. The doctors had told me later that we'd been unconscious for 2 days, while they'd stabilized our injuries. Dante with a concussion, and 3 broken ribs from shielding me with his body, me with burns on my arms and a dislocated shoulder from the impact. And that Luca had stationed an entire army outside our hospital room because the explosion had been no accident, but a carefully planned assassination attempt that had nearly succeeded. It had been Marco who'd finally told me the truth when I'd woken up disoriented and demanding answers, his face haggard with the kind of guilt that came from knowing your choices had contributed to someone else's suffering. And he'd explained that Viktor Kozlov's younger brother Mikhail had gone rogue after the commission meeting, refusing to accept the territorial compensation and deciding that the only acceptable revenge for his brother's death was our complete destruction. And he'd hired a team of specialists to plant explosives in our regular route from the commission building because he'd known we'd be returning that way. And he'd been willing to risk war with every family in New York if it meant taking us both down. "He's in the wind now," Marco had said, his hands shaking as he'd told me about the manhunt that had been consuming the entire criminal underworld. "And Dante's people are tearing the city apart looking for him. But Mikhail's smart and connected, and he has resources that make him nearly impossible to track. And the worst part is that he's made it clear this isn't over, that he won't stop until both of you are dead. And Sophia, I'm so sorry, because if I'd never created that fake dating profile, if I'd never dragged you into this world, you wouldn't be lying in a hospital bed with a target on your back that might never go away." But I'd stopped him before he could continue with his self-flagellation, reaching out with my good arm to grab his hand with a strength that had surprised us both. And I'd told him with absolute certainty that I didn't blame him for the chain of events that had led me here, that every choice I'd made since that first date had been my own, including the decision to marry Dante and challenge Viktor and stand before the commission as an equal rather than hiding behind my husband's protection, because agency mattered, and I refused to let anyone, even well-meaning Marco, reduce me to a victim of circumstances beyond my control, when the truth was that I'd chosen this life with my eyes wide open, and I'd choose it again even knowing the cost. "I need you to do something for me," I'd said to Marco, the idea forming even as I'd spoken it. "I need you to discharge yourself from this guilt you've been carrying and channel that energy into something useful, because Dante's going to need his brother in the coming weeks, not the shell of a man who's too busy blaming himself to actually help. And more importantly, I need you to trust that I'm exactly where I want to be, even if where I want to be is terrifying and dangerous, and nothing like the safe life I could have had if things had gone differently." The conversation with Dante when he'd finally woken up 6 hours after me had been harder and more painful than anything Viktor had done to me in that basement, because I'd watched him struggle with the terrible weight of knowing that loving me had nearly gotten me killed twice in the span of a month, and I'd seen the moment when he'd decided that the only way to protect me was to let me go, to set me up with a new identity, and enough money to disappear and live the quiet life I supposedly deserved, somewhere far from the violence that followed him like a shadow. "I can't do this anymore, Sophia," he'd said, his voice breaking on my name in a way that had shattered something inside my chest. "I can't keep watching you nearly die because my enemies know that hurting you is the fastest way to destroy me. And I won't be the reason you end up dead before you're 30 because I was too selfish to let you go when I had the chance. So I've already made arrangements. Luca has paperwork for a new identity, accounts set up in your name, and a house in a place where nobody will ever connect you to the Valentini family. And all you have to do is say yes, and you can walk away from this nightmare and have the life you should have had if my brother hadn't fucked everything up with his deception." But I'd been ready for this argument, had known it was coming since the moment I'd woken up, and understood that we'd survived another attempt on our lives, because Dante's instinct had always been to protect the people he loved by pushing them away, rather than letting them close enough to be used against him. And I'd be damned if I was going to let him make the mistake of thinking that safety without him was somehow preferable to danger with him. "No," I'd said simply, the single word carrying all the defiance and determination I'd cultivated since entering his world, and I'd watched his face crumple with a mixture of relief and despair as he'd realized I wasn't going to make this easy for him. "Sophia, please. You have to understand," he'd started, but I'd cut him off by leaning forward despite the pain in my shoulder and kissing him with every ounce of passion and possession I'd felt, pouring into that kiss everything I couldn't find adequate words to express about how completely he'd changed me and how absolutely I refused to go back to being the woman I'd been before. "I understand perfectly," I'd said when we'd finally broken apart, both of us breathing hard and staring at each other with the kind of intensity that had characterized our entire relationship. "I understand that you're terrified of losing me. that every close call makes you more convinced that loving me is a death sentence. But what you're failing to understand is that I'm not asking for your permission to stay in this life anymore. I'm telling you that I've earned my place here through surviving things that would have broken other people. And if you think shipping me off to some safe house with a new identity is going to keep me alive, you're wrong, because Mikhail Kozlov isn't going to stop hunting me just because I'm not sleeping in your bed anymore, and I'd rather face that danger as your partner with access to all your resources and protection than as some isolated target living alone under an assumed name waiting for him to find me. The logic of my argument had been undeniable, and I'd watched Dante's face as he'd processed the truth that pushing me away wouldn't actually keep me safe, would just leave me more vulnerable while making us both miserable. And I'd seen the moment when his resolve had cracked, and he'd let himself hope that maybe there was another way forward that didn't require him to choose between my safety and our love. "Then what do you suggest?" he'd asked, his hand finding mine and gripping it like I was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Because I can't just sit here and wait for the next assassination attempt, can't keep reacting to threats instead of eliminating them before they become dangerous. And Sophia, I need you to understand that if we're going to do this, if you're going to stay and we're going to face Mikhail together, then it can't be halfway anymore. It can't be me trying to shield you from the worst of this world while you push for more involvement. It has to be complete partnership where you're as deep in this as I am, and you accept all the consequences that come with that level of commitment. And that's when I'd told him about the plan that had been forming since Marco's visit. The strategy that had been taking shape while I'd been lying in that hospital bed, thinking about everything I'd learned from navigating both the art world and the criminal underworld, because I'd realized that my unique position, not born into this life but choosing it, educated in legitimate business but blooded in criminal enterprise, gave me advantages that traditional Mafia wives had never possessed. And if I was going to survive in Dante's world, I needed to stop trying to adapt to existing structures and instead create my own power base that complemented his rather than competing with it. "I'm going back to work at the gallery," I'd said, watching his eyes widen with alarm before I'd continued. "But this time I'm not going as Sophia Chen, the art curator. I'm going as Sofia Valentini, the dealer who specializes in acquisitions of questionable provenance, and I'm going to use my connections and expertise to build a legitimate front for money laundering that's so sophisticated and well integrated into the art world that nobody will ever be able to trace it back to criminal enterprises. And in the process, I'm going to create a network of contacts and influence that makes me valuable to every family in the commission, which means that killing me stops being a strategic advantage and starts being a liability because too many people will have too much invested in keeping me alive and operational." The brilliance of the plan had been obvious even to Dante's paranoid, strategic mind, because I wasn't proposing to hide or to simply be protected. I was proposing to make myself too valuable to kill, to transform from a weakness that enemies could exploit into an asset that the entire criminal underworld depended on. And the beauty of it was that it played to my actual strengths and expertise rather than trying to force me into a role I wasn't suited for. "You want to become the criminal underworld's premier art dealer," Dante had said slowly, working through the implications with that calculating mind I'd fallen in love with. "Laundering money through legitimate acquisitions and sales, while building relationships with collectors and dealers who can provide cover for operations across multiple territories and families, which makes you not just my wife, but an independent power broker who happens to be married to me. And Sophia, that's either the most brilliant or most dangerous thing you've ever proposed, and I genuinely can't decide which assessment is more accurate." But he'd been smiling when he'd said it. That rare, genuine smile that transformed his face from dangerous to beautiful. And I'd known I'd won. That he was going to support this vision of our future, instead of trying to lock me away from my own protection. And the relief I'd felt had been almost overwhelming, because it had meant we were finally, truly on the same page about what our partnership could be. The next 6 months had been a whirlwind of transformation, as I'd systematically built my new empire within Dante's existing one, using my gallery connections to establish relationships with collectors who needed discreet ways to move money across borders, leveraging my expertise in provenance authentication to create paper trails that could withstand any scrutiny. And slowly, methodically making myself indispensable to families beyond just the Valentinis until my network had extended through every major criminal organization on the East Coast. The hunt for Mikhail Kozlov had continued in parallel with my business building, with Dante's soldiers and the Commission's combined resources tracking every lead and following every whisper of the man who'd tried to kill us. But it had ultimately been my network that had found him. A collector in Miami, who'd purchased a stolen Rembrandt through channels I'd been monitoring, had inadvertently revealed Mikhail's location, because the buyer had been one of his shell companies. And when Dante and I had traveled to Florida, with enough firepower to start a small war, we'd gone not as husband trying to protect wife, but as partners executing a joint operation where my intelligence had been just as critical as his muscle. The confrontation when we'd finally cornered Mikhail in a warehouse near the port of Miami had been brutal and decisive, and I'd stood beside Dante with a gun in my hand, had actually fired the shot that had ended Victor's brother's life, and I'd felt nothing but cold satisfaction when he'd fallen, because this was the man who'd tried to take everything from us, and I'd be damned if I was going to let him succeed. "You've changed," Marco had said to me at a family dinner weeks after Mikhail's death, studying my face with an expression that had mixed admiration with something that might have been concern. And I'd known what he'd meant, because the transformation was visible to anyone who'd known me before. I carried myself differently now, moved through spaces with the confidence of someone who knew their worth and wasn't afraid to claim it, spoke with the authority of someone who'd earned respect through competence rather than just marriage. And when I'd walked into rooms full of criminals and legitimate business people alike, they'd all recognized that I was someone to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. "I haven't changed," I'd corrected him gently, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand, because I'd wanted him to understand this crucial distinction. "I've just stopped pretending to be something I'm not. Stopped hiding the parts of myself that craved power and danger and a life bigger than what society told me I should want. And Dante didn't create this version of me so much as he gave me permission to become who I always was underneath all the conditioning and expectations. And yes, that person is harder and more ruthless than the art curator you met on that dating app. But she's also more authentic and more alive than I've ever been, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." The gala we'd attended 6 months after the commission meeting had been a perfect encapsulation of the life I'd built. A charity event at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the guest list had included both legitimate collectors and the criminal elite, and I'd moved between both groups with equal ease, discussing Renaissance techniques with museum curators while simultaneously negotiating a money laundering deal with a Chicago family head. And nobody had questioned my presence or my authority, because I'd made myself too valuable and too connected to dismiss. Dante had watched me work the room with barely concealed pride and possessiveness, looking devastating in his custom tuxedo and expensive watch. And when he'd pulled me onto the dance floor, I'd felt the weight of every eye watching us, some with envy, others with respect, all of them acknowledging that we were a power couple, in every sense of the term. "Any regrets?" he'd asked, as we'd swayed to music played by an orchestra that had probably cost more than most people's annual salary. His hand splayed possessively on my lower back, while his eyes had searched my face for any hint of doubt or dissatisfaction. And I'd understood that despite everything we'd been through and everything I'd accomplished, some part of him still worried that I'd wake up one day and realize I'd made a terrible mistake by choosing his darkness over a normal life. But I'd looked around at the glittering crowd, at the priceless art surrounding us, and the dangerous, beautiful people who inhabited our world, and I'd thought about the woman I'd been before, safe, boring, living a life prescribed by other people's expectations while the most interesting parts of myself had withered from neglect. And I'd known with absolute certainty that I'd never regret the path that had led me here, no matter how twisted and violent and unconventional it had been. "Only that I didn't kiss the right twin first," I'd said, deliberately echoing a conversation we'd had months ago, when everything had still been new and uncertain. And I'd watched Dante's face split into a grin that had made him look younger and less burdened by the weight of his empire. "Careful, Mrs. Valentini. he'd murmured against my ear, pulling me closer until we'd been pressed together in a way that had probably been inappropriate for a charity gala, but neither of us had cared. That sounds like you're planning to keep me forever, and I should warn you that forever with me means more assassination attempts and commission meetings and enemies who'll spend their entire lives trying to find ways to hurt us. And I need to know that you understand what you're signing up for, because this life doesn't come with expiration dates or exit strategies. And once you're all in, there's no going back to who you were before. But I'd pulled him down for a kiss that had been witnessed by 200 people, including several who'd write about it in society columns the next day. And I'd poured into that kiss everything I'd felt about the life we'd built together. The danger and the passion and the partnership that had transformed us both into better versions of ourselves. And when we'd finally broken apart, I'd whispered against his lips the truth that had been growing in my heart since that first moment in the restaurant bathroom when I'd looked into the wrong twin's eyes and recognized my own darkness staring back at me. That's exactly what I'm planning, Dante Valentini, forever with you, facing whatever hell comes next, as partners who make each other stronger instead of weaker. And I know exactly what I'm signing up for because I've lived it for the past year, and I've never been happier, or more fulfilled, or more completely myself than I am when I'm standing beside you ruling this dark, beautiful empire we've built together. The epilogue to our story had been written not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the small moments that had accumulated over the following years. The way Dante had started consulting me on major strategic decisions and actually listening to my input. The way the commission had begun inviting me to meetings in my own right, rather than just as Dante's wife. The way my art dealing network had expanded until I'd been moving hundreds of millions of dollars through legitimate channels for families across the country. And perhaps most importantly, the way I'd started mentoring other women who'd found themselves pulled into the criminal underworld through marriage or circumstance or choice, teaching them that they didn't have to be victims or accessories, but could claim power for themselves if they were brave enough and smart enough and ruthless enough to demand it. It had been at one of these mentoring sessions 3 years after my own introduction to Dante's world that a young woman had approached me nervously, explaining that she thought she was in trouble because she'd gone on a date with someone who'd seemed perfect, but something had felt off. And as I'd looked at her frightened, hopeful face, I'd seen myself reflected back. The innocence, the fear, the potential for transformation if she made the right choices or the wrong ones depending on your perspective. I'd looked at Dante across the room, where he'd been deep in conversation with Luca about some territorial dispute, and he'd met my eyes with that knowing look that had passed between us countless times, the silent communication that had come from years of partnership and love and shared danger. And he'd nodded his permission for me to help this woman the way nobody had been there to help me when I'd needed it most. "Tell me everything," I'd said to her, guiding her to a quiet corner where we could talk privately. And as she'd spilled her story about the charming man who'd been too good to be true, and the subtle warning signs she'd been trying to ignore, I'd felt the weight of responsibility settling over me because helping her meant potentially pulling her into this world or pushing her away from it. And either choice would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life in ways neither of us could fully predict. But I'd learned in my years as Dante's wife and partner that the most important thing wasn't protecting people from danger, but giving them the information and tools they needed to make their own choices. So I'd told her the truth about the man she'd been dating and his connections to organized crime, about the dangers and the opportunities that came with getting involved in this world, and about the fact that if she chose to walk away right now, I'd make sure she was protected, and her connection to all of this was erased. But if she chose to stay and see where this led, she needed to do it with her eyes open and her spine straight, and the understanding that there would be no going back once she crossed certain lines. "What would you do?" she'd asked me, her eyes searching my face for guidance. And I'd smiled because it was the exact question I would have asked in her position. The desire for someone who'd walked this path before to tell you which way to go, when every direction looked equally terrifying and thrilling. "I can't answer that for you," I'd said honestly. reaching out to take her hands in mine with a gentleness that had surprised us both, because ruthlessness didn't mean lacking compassion. Because what was right for me might be completely wrong for you, and the only person who can decide if you're strong enough and brave enough and dark enough to thrive in this world is you. But I will tell you this. I went on a date with the wrong twin and ended up married to a mafia boss. And it was the best mistake I ever made because it showed me who I really was, underneath all the pretending. And if you're asking yourself whether you're capable of loving someone dangerous and building a life that exists outside normal boundaries and becoming something more than what society tells you you're supposed to be, then you probably already know the answer even if you're too scared to admit it yet. She'd left that conversation with more questions than answers, but I'd seen the spark in her eyes that had told me she was already making her choice even if she hadn't consciously acknowledged it yet. And as I'd watched her walk away, I'd felt Dante's arms wrap around me from behind, pulling me back against his chest while his chin had rested on my shoulder. "You're corrupting innocent women now?" he'd teased, but there had been affection in his voice rather than criticism. "Turning them into versions of yourself who choose darkness and danger over safety and convention. And I have to say, Mrs. Valentini, I never knew I had a type until I met you, but apparently powerful women who can hold their own in my world and look stunning while doing it is exactly what I've been searching for my entire life." "She reminds me of myself," I'd admitted, leaning back into his embrace and letting myself be held by the man who'd seen all my darkness and loved me not despite it, but because of it. "And I keep thinking about how different my life would be if someone had warned me about you before that third date. If I'd known what I was walking into and had the chance to run before everything spiraled out of control. And part of me wonders if I'm doing her a disservice by giving her information that might scare her away from something that could transform her the way you transformed me." "You didn't transform because of me," Dante had corrected, turning me in his arms so we'd been facing each other, his hands cupping my face with a tenderness that had never stopped surprising me even after years of marriage. "You transformed because you had the courage to look at the darkest parts of yourself and claim them instead of hiding from them. And yes, I created the circumstances that forced that confrontation. But the choice to embrace who you really are instead of who you thought you should be. That was all you, Sophia, and nobody can take credit for that, except the woman brave enough to choose herself over safety." And standing there in his arms, surrounded by the empire we'd built together through blood and violence and love and partnership, I'd understood the final truth about my journey from art curator to mafia queen. That transformation wasn't something that happened to you, but something you chose with every decision, and every action and every moment when you had the opportunity to retreat to comfort or advance into danger. And I'd been choosing this life and this man, and this version of myself every single day since that first kiss in the restaurant, when I'd thought I was kissing someone safe and had instead found the darkness I'd been craving all along. "I love you," I'd said to Dante, the words inadequate for the depth of feeling they were supposed to convey, but the only ones we had for emotions that existed beyond language. "I love you for seeing me when everyone else only saw the surface. I love you for challenging me to become stronger instead of protecting me into weakness. And I love you for building a partnership with me instead of trying to own me. And Dante, I need you to know that every difficult thing we've survived and every impossible choice we've made has been worth it, because it led us here, to this moment, to this life where we rule together, instead of one of us kneeling while the other stands." His kiss had been answer enough, communicating everything he'd felt but struggled to express because men like Dante had been trained since childhood to see emotion as weakness and love as liability. But with me, he'd learned that vulnerability could be strength, and that the right partner didn't diminish your power but multiplied it. And as we'd stood there kissing in front of our entire organization without caring who saw or what they thought, I'd felt the certainty settling into my bones that this was exactly where I belonged. Not in the safe, predictable life I'd left behind, but here in the beautiful, terrible darkness we'd created together. The final image of our story had been captured by a photographer at that same gala months later. Dante and I standing on the museum steps overlooking the city that had become our kingdom. Me in diamonds that had once belonged to his mother, and a red dress that had made me look like vengeance incarnated. Him in black that had emphasized the danger he carried as naturally as breathing. Both of us looking at the camera with expressions that had communicated power and possession and the absolute certainty that we were untouchable together. The photograph had ended up in society magazines and criminal intelligence files alike, analyzed by people trying to understand how an art curator had become one of the most influential women in organized crime. And every analysis had missed the essential truth that had been visible in our eyes if anyone had known how to look for it. That I hadn't been corrupted or coerced or manipulated into this life, but had chosen it with the same deliberate intention I'd once applied to authenticating paintings, recognizing the real thing when I'd seen it even if it looked nothing like what I'd expected to find. I'd gone on a date with the wrong twin and ended up with a mafia boss, had stumbled into darkness and discovered it was exactly where I'd belonged all along, had transformed from someone who appreciated beauty from a safe distance into someone who created it through danger and choice, and the refusal to be anything less than completely myself. And if given the chance to go back and swipe left instead of right, to choose safety over chaos, to remain the woman I'd been instead of becoming the woman I was always meant to be, I wouldn't change a single moment of the terrible, beautiful journey that had led me here. To Dante's arms, to my throne, to the understanding that sometimes the wrong choice is actually the right one if you're brave enough to see it through to its conclusion, and that the greatest love stories aren't the ones that follow the rules, but the ones that write their own, in blood and fire, and the kind of partnership that reshapes the world to accommodate its existence. This was my empire, built from mistakes and violence and love, and I ruled it not as Dante Valentini's wife, but as Sophia Valentini in my own right, queen of the underworld, dealer of beauty and darkness in equal measure, and the woman who'd proven that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a simple swipe right on the wrong man's profile. And I had never been more grateful for that beautiful, terrible accident that had changed everything.